Welcome to Dirt Crossroads, where we'll explore what it means to be a young person living in rural America, along with rural values, well being, and really what it means to live a life well lived. Dirt Crossroads is brought to you by Rural Youth Catalyst. I'm Kathleen Moxon.
And I'm Kim Finney, and we are the co founders of Rural Youth Catalyst.
Let's start, Kim, by talking just a little bit about the genesis of Rural Youth Catalyst.
Well, this genesis probably goes back 30 years for you and I. We've been working in rural and native communities and with rural and native young people, practitioners and educators and policymakers all over the country for, I think, at least 3 decades. And you and I have been working together for, well, a decade and a half. Our focus, though, has always been on designing and scaling programs to support rural young people, and particularly those young people that are on the margins, especially opportunity youth, young people that are out of school and out of work, and living in the persistent poverty regions of the country. So we've been doing this work for a very long time. However, over all this time, what we've known was that there was a real gap in terms of just a national space for rural youth policy and practice that could work across a wide range of issues and ideas and innovative projects and really support policy that is focused on rural and native young people, and that is led by rural, for rural, and working in deep partnership with those that are working in urban communities and with all our young people. So, with that in mind, in 2019, you and I launched Rural Youth Catalyst.
So it's interesting since we've been working together, we've been watching increasing isolation and disconnection between young people, school, work, and their communities, particularly in rural and native communities. And we just saw that exacerbated by the pandemic. Now is the time when we need to make some change. I think what frustrated us most is that the focus on young people, particularly young people on the margins, this idea of opportunity youth, is a current preoccupation with preparing young people for the workforce. It's all about career pathways and apprenticeships and credentials and how efficiently and effectively we can meet the needs of employers and get young people placed in jobs without really a heck of a lot of thought about the rest of their lives, their happiness, their life satisfaction, resiliency, connection, future that may not be about work or a future if
Yeah.
that is about belonging and community.
Right? I mean, so for the young people that are often coming from a lifetime of the most intense, multiple forms of trauma, that have, less time in school. Um, and what if, and but the measures that we use for success for their transition has been placement and retention in a job and what is the starting wage.
Hmm.
And we've determined that is across the board the education and workforce outcomes that young people on some level get held to and programs get held to. But what if the measure of success was, are rural youth happy? Are they resilient? Are they responsible and engaged adults as they move into adulthood? And if those were the measures, then we know that they have the building blocks that they could to succeed. And then what would we need to help them get there by supporting programs and policies to better meet their needs?
We don't want to minimize the importance of a living wage and being able to support oneself and family. That is essentially. But we know that your race, your gender, your identity, the geography you live in has for far too long determined who and where gets to partake in the mythic American dream. Um, we know that a good income is not a determinant of quality of life. When in fact, equity isn't fixed with a good income, there must be health and safety, belonging, resiliency, and the ability to actually affect your personal level of well being over time.
Yeah. That's exactly right. What we realized was we needed a set of champions who would stand up for rural and native young people across the local, state, and national levels, and champions who really believe that young people are the future of our communities and will contribute to the fabric and vitality and diversity of rural America, and that they are worth investing in. And as our tagline would say, are our greatest assets.
Yeah. In 2020, we were able to join that international study group to look at the work that's been done in Bhutan, who measures their country's success based on an overall well being of their citizens. It's a measure they call gross national happiness. And while we may feel like that's a little fluffy, it's made up of 9 domains that affect all of us. They're domains like education, health, uh, community, time use, psychological well being, good financial security, culture, vitality, things that we think about on a regular basis that affect us on a regular basis. And so we really set ourselves on a path to think about what might look different for rural and native young people if we were to measure policy and practice success by this idea of overall well-being of our young people, not just whether they're on track to get a job.
That's right. So in 2022, Rural Youth Catalyst launched a national working group to focus on both policy and practice that would center the well being of rural and native young people. Cutting across the country's geography and rural regions, the group is comprised of 22 cross sector leaders in the field of rural and native youth work. Grounded in the work done in Bhutan, we have created an 8 domain rural youth well-being framework to inform and focus policy and practice here in the US. At the heart of our work together is systems change and our commitment to the fundamental right of rural and native young people to flourish.
This is a limited series entitled Right to Flourish. We'll be talking with members of our working group and hearing their perspectives on what it means to center well being and the right of every young person to flourish. I want to introduce our guest, Abby Kiesa. Abby's the Deputy Director of CIRCLE, and CIRCLE stands for the Center for Information and Research on Civic Learning and Engagement at Tufts University in Boston, Massachusetts. What we love about CIRCLE and about Abby is the focus on maintaining a conversation between research and practice. Abby, I didn't really give the audience much information about the center or really about you, but I thought maybe you would do a better job by just talking a little bit about your current project, Growing Rural Voters, and what you found in your research, and then how that links back to Rural Youth Catalyst.
Absolutely. Hey, y'all. Thanks so much for including me in this. Circle's been around for over 20 years. We're now a part of the Tisch College of Civic Life at Tufts University. And
Go
one of the
Jumbos.
things, absolutely, go Jumbos. We have learned over 2 decades of research just how much is influencing whether or not young people participate in their communities and in elections. Elections aren't the end all be all of civic participation, but they are one structure that happens in every single community across the country. So it's a way to one lens on looking at civic participation. And over the course of 20 years, we just kept seeing all of these uh, barriers and constraints and challenges that communities were having. And over again, we just kept seeing that young people weren't really given access. Young people weren't really included, and I like the term welcomed. Young people weren't really
Mhm.
welcomed into
Yeah.
democracy, right? And the different there and that there were huge differences amongst young people in the level of encouragement and the level of supports
Mm.
that young people were getting, according to the data that we've been looking at for years. And so we just decided we need to put a different vision out there based on our research for what we can do as communities and what we can accomplish. So instead of contributing to all of the bashing of young people and, regardless of whether or not their turnout had tripled or not, we put out a framework that we call Circle Growing Voters. And this framework is all about building ecosystems of support, access, and culture in communities, where not every young person doesn't have the same path to voting. They don't have to use the same resources, but we need to make sure, this is a framework suggests making sure that communities have different pathways and different supports so that young people have access to participating in elections regardless of their zip code, regardless of their family background, their race and ethnicity, and a whole bunch of other identity factors, so that we make sure that young people are welcomed into democracy. And so we've been thrilled to work with folks as part of the Rural Youth Catalyst Network as part of a learning community over the past year. And that learning community has been focused on bringing more knowledge from rural anchor organizations about what it could mean to grow voters in rural communities and what it can mean to make those shifts to build local ecosystems, right? So taking it a step back from doing road voter registration drives, but looking at a little bit of a structural view of a community and saying, okay, where do we need to make these connections? How can we pull young people into this planning and leadership process? And ultimately build civic ecosystems that support a wide diversity of young people instead of the ad hoc ways that we do that now. Also, it's been an excuse to work with the two of you, so who doesn't want to do that?
Love that.
Yeah, well, it's been pretty awesome to work with you as well, gotta say.
So, Abby, why don't you start, since you're part of our working group and in this think tank with us? Why
Yeah.
is it important or even critical to frame our work around well-being and equity for rural and Native youth, and especially now?
Well, you know, the lens through which I look at the world is always structural. So, um, but the lens through which we have actually been, as I kind of mentioned, forced to look at the world because of our research findings related to youth civic engagement is structural. And what we've learned and our way of thinking about how to boost youth civic participation as one domain area is that we see a relationship between youth civic engagement and robust, inclusive, multiracial democracy. We can't have robust, inclusive, multiracial democracy unless we focus on young people. And in order to have thriving communities, we have to have robust, inclusive, multiracial democracy, or else not everyone will have been heard, right? Or communities will not have been represented. And so these three things are what we see ourselves working on. And we have to think about well-being of a whole community and equity with a whole community, because otherwise we wouldn't have inclusive democracy and we wouldn't have thriving communities. And we think that, for example, thriving communities is a part, and it also goes backwards, right? Because thriving communities create the situation where access to civic participation doesn't depend on money or who you know, right? So these relationships go back and forth. And so those as our North Stars is something that makes it totally obvious for me to participate in y'all's work in the task force and have this focus on both well-being and equity. And the final thing that I'll say about this is, I know that we're using a broader definition of well-being, but one component, and one kind of that we have been talking about is mental health as well. And we know from so many sources that that's a crisis right now amongst young people. And that's one of the things where we see a relationship, unfortunately, between youth civic engagement and youth mental health. And so we have to think about all of these dimensions together in order to think about where we're going and where we're headed.
So, Abby, building off of that, when we first, at our very first working group meeting, we shared the 9 domain framework that Bhutan is using and other countries have adopted. Interestingly, in our research that Kathy and I have done over the last year or beyond now of other well-being models, particularly those that are focused on youth, what is left off, what exists in the Bhutan domain is there is a civic participation and civic good governance and civic vitality, right? Two domains. So, just sort of in my lead into this question, that one of the things that we've discovered that is left off on pretty much any other framework that we've seen, they've taken other pieces of the Bhutan model and carried it forward, right? Including, I believe, the SAMHSA model, but they have let go of good governance and community vitality, civic engagement. I know that when we, after that meeting of sharing the 8 domains and in working with you over the last year and a half, like more than once, you've pointed to the wheel, as we call it, right? The domain. So tell us, how did it, how did that change, if at all, or affect your thinking, looking at those domains? What have you done with that already?
It, it's really been incredibly grounding to participate in the task force in a thousand ways. And um, one of the ways is a reminder to us that different pathways are needed for young people, right? We've had so many different conversations about the different things happening in communities from which people are coming and in which they're working. And that has really just reminded me that, you know, we can think about all of these domains as part of part of trying to build an ecosystem, as we like to talk about. So it reinforced that this ecosystem idea with many stakeholders has been something that is critically important, but is often not thought about in the civic engagement
Mhm.
space, right? There's this perception that um,
Yeah.
what just living in a country with a democracy means you will automatically know where your county clerk's office is
Right.
and that you can register to vote online in a lot of states, right? That is not the case, right? This is all learned. And so it was also a reminder that we have to have different pathways for young people, right? Not all young people are going to be a part of high school Republicans or college Democrats, and that the local party infrastructure is crumbling.
Mm,
Um,
mm,
so that is not a reliable source for making sure that young people are welcomed into participation, right? And that they know their voice matters. So, in some communities, the stakeholders who are involved may look very different than other communities. And those stakeholders may be a part of a different sort of element of the ecosystem. And so, as we think about the domains, I keep thinking about how much is needed in addition to concrete opportunities for young people
mm,
to participate in
mm,
engagement,
mm,
because it's feeling like part of something. It can be feeling like part of something larger, feeling confident in your own voice, knowing what your opinions are. There's all of these not necessarily democracy or civic life specific
mhm,
attitudes and
mm,
skills that can come into and relate to whether or not a young person participates. And so we have to make sure that our research is thinking more holistically about why and how people participate in democracy and civic life. And that's one of the things that I've really taken away from
mm,
all of our task force conversations.
mm.
This makes me reflect on the fact that it's not all about voting. And I know you said that before, but when we talk about young people participating in their communities, it's almost like, what does that mean? That means that young
Yeah,
people care about their neighbors. That means that young people voice their ideas. It means that young people volunteer. And so it goes way beyond sort of the political spectrum to
for sure.
young people really feeling a sense of belonging and responsibility to their communities. And we have done a lot of work on the sort of exodus of youth from rural, and rural communities are very worried about sending
Hmm.
their young people out into the world, even though they need that experience. But one of the things we do know is that young people who connect deeply to their community when they
Yeah.
live in their community are more likely to come back to their community after they've had experiences in other places. And
Hmm.
so deepening those roots for young people in their community in many, many different ways is so important for rural and native communities.
And actually, I was just talking to Ruby about the data that we collaboratively envisioned and collected on that. So we're going to be excited to be talking with folks a lot more about that idea and the relationship to civic
Good.
engagement
Oh, good.
in 2024.
We're always excited to hear about your research. Just we appreciate the fact that your research really comes a lot of it from actual surveys with individual young people. So it's not just data crunching, it's really reaching out to hear the voices that are
Mhm.
out there. So we appreciate that. Hey, Abby, different people, it's sort of been interesting for Kim and I. Different people have talked about this thinking about well being across many domains as revolutionary. And
Mm.
we've been a little bit uncomfortable with that because it seems in some ways more common sense to us than revolutionary. But I don't know if you're one of the ones who thinks it's a revolutionary way to think, but maybe you could comment on that.
Well, one of the things that I think is revolutionary about this, specifically with respect to young people, is that when you look at measurement, I'm gonna get geeky on you again. When you look at measurement, so much of the measurement, especially around civic engagement, is looking at individual level data,
Mhm.
right? So we're looking at, are young people thinking this? Are they not? Are they experiencing this? What do they know? What do they don't know? What don't they know? And one of the things I think this collective well-being framework and thinking about equity asks us to do is look at what's helping or is missing
Mm.
to help to lead to those outcomes, right? That infrastructure level, we often call it civic infrastructure level.
Mhm.
Um, and so this is what makes up an ecosystem.
Mhm.
And that is absolutely really revolutionary in some spaces, right? Because we've been relying on a different kind of data. But unfortunately, you can't do that and understand well-being if you don't have both at the same time. Because then we wouldn't understand differences amongst young people and we wouldn't understand what's maybe differing and leading to the differences. So, I think that what we've been talking about is possibly revolutionary if we can get it to the level of people thinking about the structures and the infrastructure that is or isn't there for young people. Because from our lens, looking at civic engagement, civic participation, or what we like to call co-governance, um, then we have some real holes.
And Abby, we think that you're a fantastic geek, just to be clear. We love it when you
Thank
geek
you.
out. We need more geeks thinking about rural young people. So I have one quick closing question for you, Abby. I know that your time is not only tight but valuable. You sit at the intersection of research, practice, and policy, right? And
Hmm.
brilliantly sit there. Um, so you've the idea of being part of a working group and building policy and action, thinking about this practice and policy, you know, connection and continuum. What would be your vision for this group? That you don't have to give us, like the a PhD dissertation, just, in terms of this working group, and what what do you hope can happen from this?
Y'all started this conversation by talking about how so much of talking about young people is about schooling and workforce development. And, you know, in the working group, we have people who are coming from different fields and coming from obviously different communities and different regions, a real wide diversity of communities. And I'm really hoping that we can put something different out there
Mm.
so that we can see young people holistically and also not see young people as products,
Mm,
but young people as leaders and young people as community members right now who can transform and participate in building and creating. rather than being some sort of product or output, because
Mhm.
that's another shift that I think we really need to make, see young
Mhm.
people as collaborators.
Mhm.
Well, this has been great talking to you, Abby. We want to thank Abby Kiesa for joining us today and also for that partnership you bring with Circle at Tufts. It's been very valuable to us. And it is interesting that it is at this crossroads of policy and practice and data gathering. And we thank you for all that. You're
Thank
listening to
you.
Dirt Crossroads, brought to you by Rural Youth Catalyst. This is part of our Right to Flourish series. Today, we were talking to Abby Kiesa from the Center for Information and Research on Civic Learning and Engagement, Circle, from Tufts University, and hope you'll tune in to future podcasts featuring other members of our Rural Youth Wellbeing Working Group. Take care.